0032F.
Hey everyone, listen, I don't have much time. They almost found me again. Look, I found out things they don't want you to know about. I'm recording this to make sure it gets out to you, but it turns out, and hold on to your ass, that the US has a massively overblown espionage budget. No, really, it's insanely high and. Wait, what do you mean you already knew about that? Well, okay. But do you know about all the ways the government uses their espionage and how they monitor their own. Oh, right, Snowden. Yeah, no, you're right. Well, anyway, I'm going to make my way back to the studio so we can talk about espionage today on Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Waytat. I'm your host, William, and damn it, it feels really good to be back. I really miss doing this. The show feels amazing to be working on, and I am well and refreshed. Although I did only work on one episode during the break, but whatever, fuck that. Um, I will be your guide today through the weird and wacky world of espionage as we delve into why you're not a paranoid schizophrenic, you're a third eye wielding superhuman that's immune to bullets, and the government funded estrogenization of water turned you into a soft beta male. Anyways, hopefully a lot of you that are listening are new. I hope you enjoy the show and make sure to check out the backlog to get even more information on why America is so fucked. I don't have much in the way of news unless something came up in the month I was writing this and actually recording and publishing it. Yeah, that's right. I'm writing this at the beginning of December while recording the 30th of December while you're listening up to a full week after that. Crazy, right? On to the show. Also, before we get into the show, there is one announcement I have to make. Make sure that you follow and watch Win Koshika on Twitch. That's WYNKOSHIKA. I will try to be in chat during their weekend streams. And eventually, depending on like circumstances, I might be on. Assuming that one, they don't catch on to the fact that I am a piece of shit, and also that I can actually pull my own weight and bring somebody, like some audience to watch. They are a personal friend of mine, so make sure to check them out. Also, they are much better at the whole like content creator thing than I am. Anyways, like I said in the intro, we're talking about espionage and spycraft. Which, if you watch movies, especially the Bond films, you might think that you know how this works, right? A suave, super badass with more high-tech gadgets than your average cyberpunk sex shop strolls down the street in a disguise in pursuit of a notorious and highly dangerous assassin before having a gunfight with them, before blowing up their secret base with a thermonuclear warhead, and somehow no one knows. But you'd be wrong. Because while espionage is the collection of intelligence, aka information networks, it's actually not all that commonly done by super secret agents with high-tech gadgets, super cool weapons, and mastery of 17 martial arts, and with a dick game strong enough to kill. Usually it's done behind a desk or a computer screen or at a party or in an embassy, and usually someone corrupt or stupid or both mismanaging information for either a reward or because they're stupid. But in general, someone who participates in espionage is usually called a spy, shut up phone, is usually called a spy, agent, asset, or intelligent officer that works in a spy ring, which is a group of spies, in the service of a particular government, faction, or organization. Check out Waytad Nerd for more discussion on organizations. And given that information is power, especially if you're stealing information, and also, people generally don't like being stolen from. Espionage is done under layers of secrecy and redundancy to keep it away from the opposition's espionage agents, law enforcement, and the public, and front facing government in general. Since, most of those are really bad at keeping secrets, especially your secrets. And if this seems broad, it's because it is. It's intentionally dense and obfuscated because, like I literally just said, please pay attention, it is buried under layers of secrets and redundancies. Also, defining espionage is like defining war, commerce, diplomacy, or any other form of broad interaction. But espionage does have some common targets and fields. First is resource assessment. Basically, you're determining what resources another organization has. This is hard resources like oil, steel, money, population, my wiener, and available production. But it's also soft resources like popularity, alliances, your wiener, scientific knowledge, and communication capacities. But this is also an assessment of your own resources. Since having a massive organization of people means that the decision makers very rarely truly understand the scope of their own limitations. So you need someone to tell you what those are and how much stuff you have. Second would be the popular opinion and knowledge that different external and internal groups hold about you and your opposition. This is incredibly useful if you're either going to do something really fucked up to them, or if you're going to try to outmaneuver them. Because if you're a nation about to invade a rival, you should probably know if your people think that their prime minister is a dommy-mommy, because they probably won't like it much if you invade. Or if your company's employees hate working the length of shifts they work, and you're considering extending working hours to compete with another company that treats their employees better, it's also handy to know so you don't lose most, if not all, of your workers to the competition. Third is the strategic strengths of the opposition. This would be things like cultural traits, infrastructure, terrain and weather, economic power, influence, industrial capacity, and other things that would help out in a direct conflict. And this can help you understand your nation's limitations as well if you know more about your own strategic strengths through intelligence gathering. Like how the US military came to the conclusion that anyone who attempted a land invasion of the continental United States is a silly goober that we could use the Marines to commit war crimes on, because basically anywhere you invade is a fucking nightmare. With a combination of highly variable terrain, oftentimes rough terrain, basically every state having rednecks are looking for an excuse to shoot a foreigner in the face, mountains and deserts everywhere, and the economic and industrial capabilities to pump out tanks like retail pumps out industrial grade depression, it's not worth it to invade. Also, everywhere in the US, our roads are dog shit. There's no way you're rolling like hundreds of APCs down a road without it collapsing. Which means in any conflict where America's the defender, America can focus on anti-air and sea capabilities while using its soldiers to invade the enemy's land. Fourth is the military capacities of your enemies. From their training, supplies and equipment, number of soldiers, military vehicles like tanks and planes, their strategies, and the identities of their officers and leadership. All of this will help you in the fight against them. Because if you know the experience and training of their soldiers and how many there are, you know the balance of power in combat. If you know what supplies, equipment, and military vehicles they have access to, then you can outmaneuver them easier and more easily damage their supply lines. If you know their strategies and officers, you can more easily threaten them and plan around it. Yes, espionage gets dark. If you're going to war with someone, it's not glorious and honorable battle. No, if you know the identities of their military leadership, taking them out is a good step, especially if it's before the war even starts. And finally, to defend yourself from everyone else trying to do the horrific shit you're doing to other people is counter-espionage. This is basically what it sounds like. You're doing espionage on espionage, which is just as complicated and confusing as that sounds. But it's also something that you need to do. Because even if you're gathering information on your own organization, it's useful to use counter-espionage to detect anyone who might be a mole. And then, from that, you can do whatever Geneva suggestions you'd like to them. Because since it's a secret, no one will admit to knowing their spy was tortured. Because then they would have to admit they had a spy. So usually if you get caught doing espionage, no one's going to find out, and you get the good old Drukhari treatment. Also, before we talk about how this works step by step and some of the common methods, I should clarify some terminology. See, in the intelligence community, the term for the U.S. espionage agencies and also the espionage community as a whole, there's a whole lot of terms that get thrown around. Again, spy, agent, asset, intelligence officer. Now, normally these are all vaguely synonymous, but because, again, everything to do with espionage is a lie, this isn't the case nation to nation. Like how in the UK, a professional of espionage is called an intelligence officer, while their peons are called spies, agents, and assets. But in the US, a professional is called an agent, and their goobers are called spies, assets, and informants. But why the distinction between professional and otherwise? Well, because these professionals are rarely doing the job themselves. They're usually highly trained and educated, and are more rare and also usually your own citizens. So they make the head or centerpiece of your spy rings. Most of the legwork, in hostile territory especially, are made by volunteers, ideologically sympathetic terrorists or criminals, other espionage agents and officials that have been flipped to your side, and even unsuspecting members of the public within the group being spied on. Oh, also, this is not in the script, but I was watching Jormungandr again, which is a great anime. You should definitely check it out. But one of the it just reminded me, the other option is there are a lot of criminal organizations that just work directly with espionage agencies, because it's a lot better for business to work with the government than to like fight against them. And they're usually recruited for their usefulness to finding the information that the professionals need, not by their relative power or station. Meaning, if you're doing some spy work in the palace of your enemy's ruler, the people they suspect, like high-ranking government officials, are a bad idea. Even some of their own bodyguards is a bad idea. But that janitor with an all-access ID badge no one ever pays attention to, that loves the copious amounts of Overwatch hentai your nation produces, and has a nicotine addiction that would bankrupt some smaller nations? Oh yeah, that's the guy you want. But okay, let's talk about how the process works. The simplest way to describe it is the intelligence cycle. And this cycle is basically what's used by most, if not all, intelligence agencies and organizations worldwide. It's the most efficient way to go about the process. So, step one is planning. Basically, the people in charge of making decisions contact the agency to get information they want to make a decision. So, going against most spy movie narratives, let's say instead it's a small private company looking to expand its business, and the CEO wants market data to figure out what their audience wants, where their markets are, and what resources they have available, and any info on the competition they can find. So they contact their corporate espionage administrator, just go with me on this, to set up finding all the information in a formal document. Then step 2 begins. Collection, where the spies, agents, caseworkers, technicians, researchers, and other various staff, experts, turncoats, and volunteers go out and acquire the information in bulk. This is the part most of us think about with espionage and spying operations, and we kind of just ignore the rest of it. And historically, this was done in person with human sources, but more recent decades has been increasingly occupied with message interception, network technology, mass media, internet sleuthing, hacking, and even something as basic as GPS measurements, soil data, or weather analysis. So for a corporate example, that would be doing everything the CEO asked, and honestly probably a lot more than that, figuring out what the competitors are doing, figuring out interest from consumers, and even scouting potential expansion locations for viability. Of course, then you have about 10 data entry worker suicides worth of information, which if you give to any other normal data entry employee or the CEO, there would be a lot of empty desks to refill. So you now need to do processing. This is where all the collected information is narrowed down, prioritized, scoured over, decoded, and organized into a way that actually makes any sort of sense to a normal human being. Like, sure, it's probably useful and maybe a bit funny to know that the competitor's CEO has orgies every Thursday, and all of them are men that usually go around acting like boomers and tatlings. It's not really applicable right now. So that'll get put in the industry secrets folder every corporation has, in case someone starts getting a little bit too big for their britches and homophobic. But the fact that your audience is looking for very specific product that isn't expensive to produce but is a pain in the ass to acquire is very good information. As implied, It usually takes experts to get the information organized and narrowed down in this way, which is why most CIA agents are desk jockeys. Does that make them less scary? No. Does that make imagining a realistic spy movie funnier? Yes. Yeah, a CIA agent will still fuck up your entire life. Like, don't call them pansies. They're scary. Uh okay, step 4 is analysis, where that processed and collected information is then verified for being true, actually necessary, and can be turned into actual words instead of an unhinged rambling of a madman. And once it's through this process, it's actually useful intelligence that can be used, which is where we come to dissemination, where the agency gives the requested information to the person that asked for it. In this case, the CEA, who then gives it to the CEO. But the part everyone actually cares about, how is information even collected in the first place? Well, there's actually 2 ways to think about that. See, on one hand, you can go by publicly available information or make information requests. If you're trying to determine things like your enemy's ability to operate in a specific environment, getting a field agent to ask a trustworthy local would absolutely be a great way to go. And that's easily and publicly available. Or if talking to a customer base about what they want to see, sending out surveys is a good route. Or just looking at public land listings, tax records, geographical surveys, census data, and even cracking open a good old textbook can all be good ways to collect intelligence without anything underhanded. The problem is that all organizations have their secrets and hidden information, meaning that even if you ask extra nicely, the locals might not tell you everything. The government might have censored the specific information you want, or it's behind a confidentiality wall. And even ignoring that, a great way to defend from people discovering information they can use against you in your organization is just to not tell the lowest level people what's happening, and tell only the people who need a particular piece of information that information in the moment they need it. Which brings us to all the underhanded tactics that get used. And we're going to start with the least sexy tactic. Dumpster diving. Yes, everyone from spies to archaeologists agree, what people throw away tells you a lot about them. And this can be clues, like if you hire a PI to spy on your enemies and they find copious amounts of energy drink cans in the trash, implying their workers might be working overtime, or a chemical agent on the gloves in the dumpster might imply they're doing a new type of machining process. Or it can be direct information that was improperly disposed of. Stuff like receipts, letters and correspondence, notes, old documents or unneeded prints, and maybe even things like notices from employees or the union expressing disapproval. Of course, the way around this is either to ensure your garbage is stored and secured in a safe location, or by shredding or incinerating everything. Or if you deal mostly with paper, another common tactic is literally soaking it in water or some other chemical until it becomes unreadable and unrecognizable before throwing it away. But back to the ones people talk about in spy movies. First is bugs and wiretaps, which are just things that tap into or jack the signal of communication devices or the sounds in rooms where sensitive information is traded. Of course, to defend against this, you have your own specialist discreetly check for and then disable these devices in a way that doesn't notify the spy that the bugs were found, since if they know they were found, they'll just move them or destroy them all. But if you have them, they can serve as clues to find the spy, or as a trap to find the spy as they go to reactivate them. Another common tactic is using a disguise to drop by confidential or secure areas, usually using fake credentials to pretend to be an outside organization that's supposed to be there and are very important, but whose work is difficult to understand to a lay person and is way too important for normal peons to question it. So stuff like repairmen, cleaning crews, government agents, stuff like IRS or FBI agents, or hell, even a salesman. And the spy will hand over credentials that look legit, apply some pressure to whoever answered the door, or some suaveness, and hopefully get entry and not be escorted, so they get to have free reign over the area while pretending they're supposed to be there and aren't doing something suspicious or sabotaging you. And the best way to get out of this? Have security tail them. Keep someone on them and escorting them around. Keep a copy of the credentials in case you need to use them to find the person. and check up on the area after they leave for a while to make sure nothing sketchy happened. Also, in general, this is just good company policy in general. Tell your agents and employees that if they're suspicious of someone, they can always refuse entry until the person that signed the credentials lets them in. That honestly stops a lot of corporate espionage, just treating your employees like people that have their own detective skills. There's also things like cyber espionage and electronic conveniences that can be targets of espionage. Hacking into private networks is very common, but it's not really like the brute force sledgehammer method that doesn't and never really work that you see in movies. It's things like phishing scams, trickery, lies, and understanding how computers are coded and interfaced to trick the security system or the user into doing something stupid that lets you in. Or installing things like key trackers, using a virtual desk, or even sending malware and data bombs to break security. Basically, have you seen like the scammer techniques on like a Kitboga video? A lot of those are ways that you can breach security. While the convenience things usually have more lax security and are easier to access. Things like voice activation devices, message storing devices, servers, open Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, negatives for both photos and prints, and monitoring devices like security cameras and webcams all can pick up on valuable information that you can skim from. Of course, the best defense is to use as few of these as possible, ensure that you use high-quality passwords that change a lot, and proprietary software to prevent malware. Also, a great way to do it is to pay your IT people very well, because usually if someone's paid very well in IT, they will go the distance for you. Then, of course, you have things that happen because of carelessness, like having meetings in unsecured locations, or having things just simply unlocked. Doing stuff like hotel seminars, conventions, shows, and meetings in public venues or rented spaces can open up a lot of vulnerability. A classic example to demonstrate my point are the people on that one Reddit post that were annoying customers at a cafe by being way too loud. So the poster bought the domain name for the business name they had just figured out. Silly, petty, and arguably deserved, but a good example of espionage all the same. Also, to be fair, if you're doing a hotel seminar talking about confidential information, when the separators they use are made out of the vague concept of a wall and hollow-centered plastic covered in carpet with soundproofing as effective as the pull-out method, you kind of deserve to have your data leaked. You should know better. But also, sometimes your own people, or you, can make the spy's job a lot easier by just leaving things in places unlocked. It's good practice if you're doing espionage and not just breaking and entering, to check for things like unlocked doors or devices. Because sometimes you don't need to be a locksmith or use devices that attempt all 2.5 million keystroke combinations in a few seconds. If someone just forgets to log off or keeps the front door unlocked because it's a lot more convenient for them, of course, fix these by being smart and locking your fucking doors, you cretin. And finally is just good old-fashioned treason. A good way to get information, and always has been a good way, is just to be friendly and a touch sociopathic, and target people in the organization that are ambitious, greedy, unhappy, share common interests or beliefs, have addictions or habits, had previous loyalties, find you attractive, or hell, are just gossipy. Talk to them and gain their trust, and suddenly everything you'd ever wanted to know will come pouring out of them. If they like and trust you, they'll open up or express some conflict of consciousness or interest for you to exploit or blackmail them with, which can then flip them into a spy in your ring. Or maybe you legitimately like them and are using their access to help them out, but you're a spy. That's unlikely. So the best way to counter this is to keep your team in line. Tell them only what they need to know, and avoid hiring gossips or people who get too uppity about wanting to replace you. Of course, I will say, from a leftist, little piece of shit point of view, that is a red flag if your employer refuses to hire you because you're ambitious. Probably not great to work for them. So, I mean, kind of a win-win. But if you're more of a spy master and less the one getting your hands dirty, there's some things for you to keep in mind too. Straight from the desk of Sun Tzu. And look, if you're a spy or an agent rolling your eyes at that, this is just the foundation, alright? I doubt that you would want me digging into your actual organization's methodology as much as I don't want to be sent to a secret government training camp where they're going to stick things in my butt and pour stuff on my face, and not in the fun way. So, Sun Tzu first reminds us that foreknowledge is your lord and savior. Knowing things about your enemy that they don't know about you, shut up phone, will always be an advantage. So spies are absolutely necessary to use. Secondly, your spies should be organized into 5 groups. Local spies, which are citizens of your enemy's own nation that feeds you info. Inward spies are enemy agents, officials, and spies that work for you. Converted spies are agents that openly have turned sides against them. Doomed spies are agents that are given false information or suicidal orders meant for your enemy to find or intercept and either receive false information or disguise your true spies. And your surviving spies are the ones that get to come home and report back to you. Yeah, kind of fucked up, but that's espionage for you. It's basically war. Third, you should pretty heavily reward your spies, since they have the info you need and have to trust that they are at least vaguely loyal, and their work is unimaginably dangerous. Giving them a lot of money, status, and or BJs is a great way to keep them on your side, especially if no one else can give them those things. Fourth, as a spy master, you should treat your spies with both wary distance and kind justice. Be iron-fisted and never let your spies assume you're friends, but also don't be a dick. Keep it professional and demonstrate trust and appreciation, but if they fuck up, deal with them quickly in front of everyone in a way that leaves no questions about what will happen to you if they betray you. So like how retail workers are treated by management, but, actually appreciative. But to actually focus on the enemy, you need to know your enemy on every level. Know the identities of and get a good read on anyone who can assist you, forget about you, pass on information, or use their knowledge to verify information. Make sure your spies have good relationships with both each other and the contacts you've made amongst your enemy. Ensure they know those people you identified and how to get on their good side. Again, a lot of spy work is kissing ass and talking to people and having a good memory, not long-distance sniper duels or intense hacking montages. And finally, whenever possible, convert the enemy spies to your side, since they'll have more confidential information than anyone else and know more about how your opponent does their counter-espionage and espionage operations than you ever will. But, okay, we've gone through 7 pages at about half an hour of tactics, categories, definitions, management, and secrecy. So what's the point? Why does basically every nation, corporation, or organization in the entire world play this game? Well, because it's an advantage. And even if you don't think you have enemies, someone hates you. Someone who'd be willing to do something underhanded. Someone who feels like they need to beat you. So it's a good idea to do it first. Basically, espionage exists because a caveman realized that lying is a great way to get what you want. It's a necessity because whenever you don't participate, you stand to lose things you don't want to. Even if it's gross and unpleasant, you need to be a functional organization to have organizational security and deterrence. Knowing more than your enemy, or even them thinking you do, is a great preventative measure. But with that, we're going to go over the history section. And we begin in the 4th century BC, but really technically any era in the BCs. In the 4th century, Sun Tzu writes The Art of War, and Chanakya, who is very interesting, but for this episode is basically Indian Sun Tzu. Do not send me emails on that. I know there's so much more of this guy. Just trust me, there's too much. It would be a whole other show to talk about just him. He writes the Arthashastra. Also, again, apologies for you new people. I'm terrible at pronouncing things. You will see that forever. But both of these writings heavily promote the use of spies, covert operations, and intelligence gathering for war and empire building. Sun Tzu was more focused on war. Chanakya was more focused on empire building. The ancient Egyptians, Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans all very prevalently used a lot of spies and espionage. In fact, all matter of ancient civilizations and powers had well-used espionage networks. I just point out those ones because those are also like very well-known like military powers of their time. So like they have a long tradition of using espionage because it works. But with that, we're actually going to skip into the post 1000s AD. Feudal Japan, who've been having, let's say, some issues with those pesky fucking shinobi around that time, around the time that shifted more feudal, began to repurpose and flip shinobi into assassins and espionage agents for the state. And yes, the rebellious ones were still around, but that's another story for another day. There's actually probably podcasts you can listen to about the history of ninjas and shinobi and the differences between those. In the 12th century, King David IV of Georgia, the country, not the state, organized the Mistovaris, which were the secret police and spy organization that did things like exposing conspiracies, arresting, and totally not murdering rebels, counterintelligence, and infiltration. 200 years later, the Mongols invade, most of the world, heavily using their own espionage forces and agents ahead of the army to find soft targets and to report on enemy capabilities. While in the Americas, the Aztecs used the diplomatic Pochtecas and the warrior Quimichkin to conduct spycraft, both economic and militaristic. But it wasn't until the Elizabethan era that spies were really centralized in an organized manner in an official capacity. At least with the primary purpose of being spies, a lot of organizations have been around for a long time, and look, it just starts the modern intelligence organizations. Okay, I just need a transition. So this group was founded by Francis Walsingham, England's Secretary of State at the time, and he assembled his Avengers team of Arthur Gregory and Targus and Thomas Philippes. See, I'm bad with like Western European names too. Don't worry about it. Along with a few others that aren't notable enough to get their own names, as per English tradition, and worked with the seal breaker and working with the seal breaker and cartographer, he was able to establish a massive espionage network across mainland Europe and within other espionage groups. And the group they were founded to hunt down like feral raccoons in the streets, British Catholics, founded their own organization to hunt down this group behind Hugh Owen. However, they ultimately failed. Included in their achievements was placing Mary Queen of Scots in custody, with Sir Amos Paulette reading all of her letters. But this was a ruse, as they made it appear as though she could sneak out some of her letters through beer kegs. But that was a plant by Walsingham, and so they managed to intercept many of the letters anyways, which ultimately kind of fucked up Mary Queen of Scots' rebellion. And by the 18th century, due to the increasing size of militaries, destructiveness of wars, ever-expanding bureaucracies of multi-continental nations, and massive national budgets, most nations choose to found their own intelligence agencies, with England and France establishing the Cabinet Noir, where letters from foreign powers would be opened, deciphered, and checked before being sent to the actual recipient. And France doubled down by gaslighting everyone into believing their spy network was immense and that their spies were everywhere, both at home and abroad, which made both criminals and foreign governments alike terrified that everyone was secretly a French informant or spy. And on the British end, also by the way, one of the best tactics in espionage is to make your enemy fight ghosts. So that is a genius move. But on the British end, to deal with the constant wars they were in, leaned on decoding the code systems of other nations and used spies and analysts to decode and determine the capabilities of their enemies rather than doing like large-scale operations, because that would be way too expensive. In 1719, to try and curb other nations stealing their industrial secrets, they made it illegal to try and get workers to emigrate from them. Despite this, industrial espionage only ramped up. By the middle of the 18th century, both France and Spain took some amount of technology from European industrialists, especially British shipbuilders and steel manufacturers. Then the French Revolution occurred, And terrified of France coming out of this stronger than they already were, the Brits sent waves of spies into France to monitor the French and Irish threat. Yes, you heard Irish. They sent spies to France to spy on the Irish. And you wonder why I call them crayon chewers. But in the wake of this, the British developed their centralized system of espionage, still used to this day, and Napoleon turned the power of the French spy on the world at large. But a new challenger had appeared with the turn of the 19th century. Mother Russia. With plans to establish a network of loyal nations across the Middle East and Central Asia, including British-held India. Not known for taking their massive Slavic memories lying down, the British engaged them in a secret espionage war called the Great Game. Yes, 40k nerds, that's where that term comes from. But seeing as they couldn't really match the whole, Russian part of the Russian spies, and yes, Russian spies have always been like that, they focus much more on code cracking and mail fraud, while the Russians focus more on infiltration and various forms of abuse and battery. However, the Great Game sharpened both agencies, giving the Russians experience against the spy agencies of Europe and teaching the British that cover stories like archaeologists, botanists, and twink courtier that's totally into you don't really work in hardcore spycraft, especially against Russians. But this establishment of professional organizations and agents is very fortunate as the colonial and national rivalries between nations begin to heat up even more, accelerating military development and, as you know, eventually devolving into war. In 1856, after the Crimean War, military attachés become common in Europe, which are on paper diplomats and ambassadors, but more practically are spy masters. Also during the 1800s and the first few years of the 1900s, a lot of agencies are established, like the Austrian Evidenzbüro in 1850 after the Revolution of 1848, or the intelligence branch of the War Office in Britain in 1873, or France's Vieux Bureau in 1871. If you speak French, don't come at me. French is a more made-up language than any other one. Or Germany's Abteilung 3B in 1889, or Italy's Ufficio Informazioni del Domando Supremo in 1900, and Russia's 7th section post their defeat in 1905 against the Japanese. Around this time is also the founding of the spy novel. And please forgive me. Okay, I say this every episode. Please forgive me in the history sections for mangling everything. It is so hard to figure out how to switch between different, pronunciations of languages, and I'll be real with you. At some point, I just give up. I can't. In 1903, the British, seeing a possibility of war in Europe and Germany especially preparing for war, founds MO3, the granddaddy of their modern espionage wings. 6 years later, they found the Secret Service Bureau and divided them amongst various counterintelligence services in connection to Scotland Yard. And they named these Military Intelligence 1 through Military Intelligence 19, which of these only 2 exist today, MI5 and MI6. And then World War I happened. All of the major powers involved had their intelligence networks well prepared beforehand, so now it was just time to actually test them. And during the early days, they were honed even further. And for the Allies in particular, it was discovered quickly how much of an advantage their espionage game was at. Because if you go for the long con, they were the ones largely on the defensive, with a lot of German-occupied French and Belgian villages in enemy territory that weren't exactly stoked about it. So by the end of the war, the Allies had established more than 6,400 French and Belgian citizens as spies, which allowed for the interception of troop movements and supply lines, most effectively being the Waveform founded Dame Blanche ring established in 1916, who were responsible for about 75% of all information going to the Allies out of the region of Belgium. In comparison, the German spy network was isolated, small in scale, and didn't very effectively use their information networks. In fact, Just one day after declaring war on Britain, their entire spy network got their jaw rearranged the long way around by British counterintelligence, with the sole exception of Jules C. Selber, who would go on to become the British's chief censor in the censor office, which would give him a lot of information. And during the course of the war, a monster of an espionage machine had been created. The British espionage community's ability to intercept, read, decode, and implement messages became so impressive that by 1915 they were also reading U.S. secret messages. An economic ally that had yet to be involved in the war, and from all perspectives, would be on their side. They also intercepted messages to Mexico from Germany, trying to pressure them into war, and use this as fuel to push America into the war. And they could essentially track the German fleet in real time, allowing them to play major influence on World War I's naval battles. After the war, during the Russian Revolution, British spies once again changed espionage forever. Because, see, in the olden days, espionage between nations was treated like a gentleman's sport. Wealthy young men searching for adventure would become a spy for the crown and go out to adventure, winning in chess matches of wit and honor with fellow highly educated wealthy spy masters. But Sidney Riley and Sir Paul Dukes realized that this would not work in Russia. So they changed the game, turning it into a brutally efficient war of lies, tricks, manipulation, and cold-hearted, ruthless murder. Which worked well since they managed to infiltrate Lenin's secret circle. And in part, learning from them and also from exposing them, the Soviets decided that the glove fit pretty well, and the Soviet GRU began to operate worldwide. And after the interwar period during World War II, the Germans somehow failed to learn their lesson. They were still shit at spying, and making it worse, their spies drank the flavor aid and fully believed the Nazi propaganda that they were better than everyone else. Combined with awful recruiting, faulty execution, and problematic planning, they failed to infiltrate much of the US, though they still had a lot of sympathizers, or really effectively do much before the war anyways. And once the war began, Churchill told his intelligence agencies to set Europe ablaze, which if you didn't know is the equivalent to breeding a dog for aggression, teaching it nothing but fighting, pumping it full of doggy steroids and PCP, and then letting it off its leash near a retirement community. The British intelligence were able to feed and arm the Greek People's Liberation Army, French resistance fighters in the Maquis, and hurt the German war effort through lost supplies and manpower through systemized and efficient espionage, guerrilla attacks, revolutions and uprisings, revealing supply lines, and assassinations. In fact, the Germans began to call troops away from the front just to deal with it, which also didn't work very well for them. And then we actually get kind of sparse, surprisingly, because a lot of these things are still going on or are very dense. So the Cold War is when basically every major power had insane levels of espionage. Because World War II shook up the political snow globe of the planet, but military technology's advancement made everyone kind of trigger shy about starting another war. So instead, everyone used espionage to effectively conduct a secret war. And if you're wondering why I'm skipping this period in history, it's the same reason why I don't usually go into detail about stuff that happened in World War II. You could have a 15-year running podcast uploading weekly talking about the Cold War and still only be in 1970 right now. I'm not opening up that can of worms. But for some more modern espionage, we have the Palestine Papers in 2011 and the Panama Papers in 2016. The Palestine Papers were about 1,600 pages of documents that surrounded peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, which showed that Palestine, unsurprisingly, considering where we're at now, were very open to peace negotiations, including giving a fuckload of concessions to the Israelis. However, Israel refused to negotiate and used the entire time to make soy jack memes. Same with the Americans involved in the negotiations. And while I will say, there's been questions about validity and backlash about the contents and the reasons for the leak, this isn't particularly out of character for Israel or the US. And the 2016 Panama Papers was a leak of about 11.5 million, yes, million, confidential documents that expose 214,000 companies as shell companies, and how a lot of corporations use offshore shell companies to evade taxes, fund bribes, and use company funds for personal use, which increase the distrust in corporations and reduce tax avoidance. And you could very well link this leak to the silly thing that happened in New York recently that made people remember that while violence isn't the answer, it'll certainly start a conversation. Speaking of which, America. During the American Revolution, George Washington and the Continental Army relied very heavily on espionage to survive the war, including the Culper Ring, formed by Benjamin Talmadge in New York to collect the information of British loyalists. And compared to the Americans and their French allies, the British spy network in the colonies was really, really bad, so they couldn't really perform much counter-espionage or manage to get much useful intelligence. The Americans, on the other hand, were able to amass a ton of military intelligence, perform a lot of political action, run counterintelligence, and propagandize through the Continental Congress, who found the Committee of Secret Correspondence to gather foreign intelligence and the Secret Committee to supply pirates with gunpowder and barter with other powers secretly for supplies. And there's a ton of secret arms deals performed with some of the Founding Fathers that are so secret, we still don't know what they were. Don't get too conspiratorial, though. It's because the records were burned as soon as the deal was done, not because it was done with lizard people or anything like that. So basically, during the Revolution, spies were incredibly important but faded from prominence for decades. Until the Civil War, which we have a ton of records of, but I'm going to be real with you, is not worth covering. Because there was basically zero centralized or organized attempts at spycraft, despite the fact that it was incredibly widespread. Because for much of America's history, spycraft wasn't a particularly organized venture, and we mostly did it because we needed to, and would just select someone already in good position to get info to be our spy, until we didn't need one anymore. Except for the military. Military intelligence, especially the Office of Naval Intelligence, had been America's primary espionage vehicle for most of our history. During World War I, however, ONI really dropped the fucking ball because we failed to notice the German spies filling our industrial sector, even before we got involved in the war. However, they were so shit at their jobs that most of the attempts at industrial sabotage failed, and the ones that succeeded were treated as everyday industrial accidents. Which, if you didn't know America, is lower on our list of priorities than ensuring children have access to heavy infantry support weapons, so we didn't really notice. But after the war, and the British told us, hey dude, there were like a ton of German spies in your borders, we realized it might be a good idea to actually have a law on the books to dissuade spies. So we passed the 1917 Espionage Act, which makes it illegal to, quote, obtain information, record pictures, or copy descriptions of any information related to the national defense with intent or reason to believe that information may be used for the injury of the U.S. or to the advantage of a foreign nation. End quote. So, basically, spies. Made it illegal to be a spy. And this was meant to crack down on wartime espionage, dangerous behavior, and disloyalty. Which, yikes. But okay. Let's hold out some hope for America. In the 1930s and 40s, seeing as America had an inkling that maybe Japan didn't like us with their whole, sharpening swords and telling us that cock-blocking them from skinning the French alive was a bad move, had started trying to crack the Japanese code system. With the combined powers of the civilian sector, Army intelligence, and naval intelligence, the U.S. was able to crack the codes red and blue. However, once Japan and Germany became allied, the Germans gave them their own Enigma machines and created the Purple Code, which gave Americans a run for their money until in 1941 we managed to crack the code. Basically, just as we were getting involved in the war. Which is a massive fucking whoopsie on Japan's part. You see, Germany initially planned to wine and dine America, sucking its dick a bit, and then maybe invade when the war in Europe was done. They'd had experience in getting spanked by the Americans. Japan, however, being maybe a little horny at the thought, not only touched our boats, but did it after a top Japanese admiral said that this was a terrible idea, Their purple code had just been broken, and the British were already reading most Axis communications in Europe, and Japan's reservoirs of steel were already being stretched and nearly depleted. Once we got fully involved in the war, Britain told us that we should probably have our own espionage agency if we really wanted to commit mass arson on mainland Europe with them, a common bonding experience between the two nations, and so the Office of Strategic Services was established and trained in Canada. And oh boy, burn we did. Also in 41, after FDR became frustrated with the comically large piles of intelligence information on his desk in the form of a series of 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles, he established the Office of the Coordinator of Information and assigned the World War I hero General William Donovan to its head in order to sort the information into something he could actually fucking read and not try to throw himself out the window. A year later, the OSS became America's official first centralized intelligence agency, doing all the classic American intelligence agency things like information gathering, paramilitary operations, spycraft, and making the lives of black people worse. No proof on the last one, but this is the grandpa of the CIA, and that had to come from somewhere. Anyways, by 1945, seeing that the war was over, the OSS and a lot of other espionage agencies founded for World War II were abolished and combined into the Strategic Services Unit, which was then overtaken by the CIG at the beginning of the Cold War. And within a few months, under Truman's choice of Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, the CIG became the primary agency for all kinds of clandestine activity. However, it was kind of limited in functionality because both the Armed Forces and the Department of State had to approve its actions, which is a problem for spies, but arguably good for the health of the nation in general. In 47, the CIA is founded to take over these duties in the National Security Act, becoming its own independent branch of the government's power. And then, in one of the moves of all time, Truman founds the NSA to monitor espionage at home under the guidance of some of his senior officials. Now, we've already touched on the Cold War, but we didn't really mention America's part. See, this is when America decided we needed a spy network because we adopted the whole better dead than red policy about communism. And since everyone decided that we can't just go around shooting anyone with social service programs in the face, our spies need to be just as good as the Russian spies. Which was a tall order considering the history of Russian spies. So over the Cold War, America tried very, very hard to match the Russians, including streamlining and reorienting the intelligence community to not only be faster but more efficient and, honestly, a lot more brutal. By the end of the Cold War, we had created a monstrosity. Our intelligence community had massive worldwide reach and could do basically whatever they wanted through intimidation, violence, ideological extremism, blackmail, and all manner of espionage. Even within the borders of the US, there's countless accounts of politicians and government organizations terrified of the NSA, CIA, and ONI. But then, the thing pushing the intelligence community forward and justifying its insane level of power, influence, and violence was brought down as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, and the only communist nations in the world that still survived were smaller threats like Vietnam and North Korea, or large, quickly capitalizing nations like China. So our espionage systems were modified again to turn it towards persecuting criminal threats and terrorism than other nations. At the same time, and probably in large part because of the apparatus, the US government began to realize that looking like a totalitarian Big Brother state, where some arms had almost unlimited power, influence, and money, and others were anemic and had essentially zero authority, was really efficient and also a great way to lose the American people entirely. So the government made moves to be more trustworthy, accountable, and interconnected, which, overall, cut down a lot of these spy organizations back to a more reasonable level. However, despite this, American espionage agencies developed a reputation of being just as terrifying as Russia's, which, I mean, makes sense. They were our biggest rivals. But, like most of these episodes, then 9/11 happened. After 9/11, the government let go of the leash on the intelligence community like they had during the Cold War, largely because it was such a surprise attack that did a lot to not only embarrass the government, but terrify the people and attempt to devastate the US's morale and organization. And both reasonably and unreasonably, this couldn't stand. However, unlike the Cold War, while the public was initially in support, within a matter of a few years, the narrative changed. America wasn't heroically protecting the Western world and fighting evil. No, they were part of an industrialized capitalist war engine built on the shadow of colonialism and Western supremacy. Now, to those of you that know Cold War history, that might tickle some taints. Because the truth of the matter is that the reason why the narrative is different isn't because people today are soft or liberals or pussies, and not because America got worse. It's because the narrative is harder to control in a world with internet, mass media, cameras that don't take 12 hours to set up, and no nation in a position to directly fight us for us to unreasonably hate. And this isn't helped by Snowden in 2013, who was the whistleblower that revealed that the NSA and UK's GCH were performing mass intelligence gathering programs on their own people. And as we pulled the thread, the American public learned that the NSA, CIA, FBI, and a lot of other three-letter organizations had access to levels of information and monitoring that was so incredibly alien to the American people that it took us a long time to come to grips with. Who am I kidding? It took 2 years for us to get used to it, and 2 years to forget who Snowden was and believe the hype that he was an evil communist exposing America's secrets so that the terrorists could win. Really, honestly, we should be more pissed about it. We should have never just assumed everything was fine. But these leaks did cause reform in the procedures and organization of the NSA, and we totally have no issues regarding espionage anymore. Let's talk about numbers. Now that you have the general outline of the history of espionage, how it's done, and why, let's get into some of the details. Kinda. See, the issue is that since espionage is, secret, it's hard to find a lot of concrete data about specific efficiencies, grading, and number of agents, and even agencies, and the amount of time and resources nations spend on those agencies. This is also why we're not talking about opinion this episode, because getting a public opinion on espionage agencies won't really show you anything that we don't already know. So, to figure out some of the best nations that spycraft in the world, we're going to look at some vaguely publicly available rankings based on a combination of the surveillance capacities of a nation weighed by public and professional consensus. And this will be out of a total of 6 points. And yes, this was mostly entirely based off of a news organization. Sue me if you want to, but you'll never get your hands on my sugar crisps. At number 12, we have South Korea with a total of 1.48, and Japan at number 11 at 1.49, and Germany comes in next at 2.5. Well, 2.05. Which, hey, pretty respectable, considering the agencies and nations they've historically had beef with. Ninth is France, also at 2.05, which, again, makes sense considering their history of having good spies, although them being equal to Germany does kind of suck for them. But then we have Australia at number 8 with 2.69, nice, which is surprising considering we haven't heard anything about... I see, I get it. 7th is the UK at 3.8, which again shouldn't be surprising. At 6th is Pakistan at 4.16, and India at 5th with 4.81. Which, if you're not woke like I am, you might be surprised. But these two countries have had their own Cold War for about, I would say as long as they've existed. And both have nuclear armaments, and the war keeps getting within a few inches of being hot, and also neither one wants to listen to the UN telling them to chill out. So, that's scary. 4th, unsurprisingly, is Israel at 4.82. Which, if you understand that Israel is an awful nation, and you can say that without being an anti-Semite, you aren't surprised by. Both conservatives and liberals can shut the fuck up on this one. One of you likes them because they're fascist, and the other likes them because they're Jewish. Anyways, number 3 is Russia, with a 5.29, followed by China at 5.6, and then the US at 5.8 out of 6. Yes, we are number one worldwide in espionage, which should be unsurprising considering our 18 espionage organizations. I mean, it's like if you had a dick measuring contest and won, not because you have the largest penis, but because you pulled down your pants to reveal a cluster of 18 of them, proving you have the most dick per capita. You're lucky your mom's house wasn't participating, by the way. And what are those agencies, you ask? Well, they're the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Office of Naval Intelligence, Coast Guard Intelligence, Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Central Intelligence Agency, National Air and Space Intelligence Center, National Security Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. Army Intelligence, Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Marine Corps Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance Enterprise, National Geospace Intelligence Agency, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, Intelligence Branch, Office of National Security Intelligence, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and the National Space Intelligence Center. Or, if we're going to abbreviate all of it, ODNIONICGIINRCIAUSAFISR Enterprise, NSANRODIA Office of the G2, OICI, Marine Corps didn't abbreviate, probably because they don't know that they could do that, NGAOIBIBONSIIANSIC. Fuck you, script me, for making me say that out loud, and fuck you, recording me, for saying fuck me. Anyways, unsurprisingly, all of that means that America spends the most on espionage. But, let's edge a little longer and go from the bottom up. Of course, as always, this is converting to USD and isn't necessarily an exact number since it's, classified. At 15 is Iran's MOIS, which nets $400 million. Canada's CSIS gets somewhere between 465 and 470 million. Switzerland's NDB gets 460 to 475. Indonesia's BIN gets 492 million. Wow. And Saudi Arabia's GIP gets $495 million. Which just now brings us to the top 10. 10th is Germany's BND with a budget of 515 to 520 million. And the last one of the millions of dollars range is France's DGSE with 635 to 640 million. So far, 7 of the top 15 most well-funded intelligence agencies in the world would have a total combined budget of $3 billion. Take or give a few million. And that's going to be laughable in a minute. South Korea's NIS has a budget of $1 billion. Mexico's CISEN has a budget of $1 to $1.1 billion. Italy's AISE has a budget of 2.2 to 2.3 billion, and the UK's MI6 has a budget of 2.8 to 2.9 billion. So yes, $3.4 billion is starting to look laughable. Russia's FSB spends 3.2 to 3.3 billion, and China's MSS spends 4.2 to 4.3 billion dollars. And our runner-up, Japan's PSIA, spends 4.6 to 4.8 billion dollars, which just leaves America, which unsheathes its massive ween and smashes the table with it with a budget for the CIA of $75 billion goddamn United States dollars every year for one of 18 intelligence agencies. This is 3.5 times more money than the other 14 nations I just listed combined. And see, this is why we don't have socialized medicine. Well, it's 2 of the reasons why we don't have socialized medicine, which is actually a major issue. See, during the 60s and 70s, the CIA had basically free reign to do whatever they wanted. And do whatever they wanted, they did. But nowadays, the only things that they need to do are get results and keep the public in the dark, and they essentially have that same free reign. Meaning that, yes, they're kept on a tighter leash because it's harder to hide things nowadays from a cynical, chronically online, and paranoid public, but they still get away with a lot of shit that just isn't directly in front of our eyes. But that actually isn't the biggest issue with espionage overall. No, the biggest issue is that the world has become more interconnected and a bigger and bigger melting pot of ideologies, ideas, and human connection. Which is a good thing. But remember all the ways to attract spies? Yep, ideological loyalty has been one of the biggest for a long time. But you can't lie anymore. If you tell someone in a communist nation that America is a land of freedom and capitalism, there's a good chance they know at least a few of the bad things that come with that, which can create doubt. So instead, we've bred generations of spies to be motivated by wealth, meaning spies are becoming easier to flip and are basically just down to who's willing to spend the most on them, which is very dangerous to intelligence officers, spy rings, national security, and even the concept of world peace or cooperation. But speaking of world peace, espionage is actually deeply detrimental to that too. Because yes, sure, we spent time in the beginning talking about how it can maintain peace. But that isn't lasting peace. Espionage erodes trust between nations and organizations and also creates instability. From jeopardizing secrets that are kept secret for a good reason, strategic information that makes hostilities attractive, false information that breaks down bonds of friendship and community, to revealing trade secrets that collapse economies or companies, and even the need created for counter-espionage. On top of you needing to keep a close eye on your spies, which requires bureaucracy, you also need to keep them at a distance and make them flexible, independent agents, which makes that bureaucracy unstable. So overall, when espionage becomes common, whatever situation is being maintained by it becomes unstable, with the fallout of it collapsing being much worse than it otherwise would be, while strangling out any cooperation by creating suspicion of everyone and everything. But it's not like we can just stop using it. Of course, espionage is also questionable in the sense that there's controversy surrounding not only its use, obviously, but also because it's a crime. During times of war, espionage slips very easily into being a war crime of some sort, even to the extent that there's a lot of what you do in espionage that is expressly against international law, and even during peacetime, most nations have laws on the books to make it entirely illegal. So this creates a lot of questions in gray area about what constitutes legal espionage and illegally trading secrets or committing acts of treason. Combined with that, spies are usually pushed to circumvent or break the law to do their job, especially to avoid regulation, documentation, or counter-espionage. Which means on top of already being in a gray area, the only surefire way to control a bunch of spies is one with a bigger gun and a better network. Which is problematic if the guy that oversees them isn't a spy. So spy rings can end up being technically not independent miniature organizations that have a dubious relationship with morality and are at times either doing something illegal or borderline illegal with not a whole lot of oversight, trading in stolen and redistributed information. Which, all said out loud, should be as fucking terrifying as it sounds. But finally, while it's become a meme how closely and deeply monitored we are by espionage agencies, in the US and UK, we shouldn't be cool with it as we often are. It's a joke when you say something controversial to comment about your phone listening to you, or your FBI agent watching every keystroke. And while those are clearly jokes, we shouldn't be chill like that. It's objectively horrifying that at any moment our privacy could be getting violated for a vague notion of national security. But at the same time, from a strategic perspective, it doesn't do much. Despite all the funding and the influence and the power that's given, do you know how many terror plots the NSA has stopped? 0. And why? Well, because first of all, it's a massive resource and focus sink to monitor 330 million people. Because despite spies doing Because despite spies most often being citizens of a nation being spied on, it's really not worth it, especially now, because we know it's happening and how it's happening. So real spies will just circumvent that. Additionally, because of our rights and the rights of corporations to have trade secrets and having to honor contracts, they don't even have access to everything. Your home assistants are listening. Amazon Alexa is listening to you, but they report to Amazon, not the government. And the government would have to ask them for access, which Amazon doesn't want to do because it's not technically legal to record people when they don't know it, but they are doing it. So it's useless, but it happens, and we should be outraged, but we aren't. Okay, before I get too carried away, let's go to the soapbox. Share my opinion. Alright, so clearly I kind of let my opinion slip a little in the issues already. Just a tad. What's the deal with espionage? What do I think about it? Well, weirdly enough for a leftist, I'm actually mostly okay with it. Now, hear me out. I'm okay with it not because I think it's super cool or amazing or badass. My opinion is similar to how I feel about the military as an organization. Espionage has a lot of stuff wrong with it. A lot of things that need to be better. But I don't begrudge any organization for having a counter-espionage department at the very least, nor do I begrudge an organization for having espionage. It'd be like getting angry that a country has a national guard or military. It's dirty, morally dubious, and brutal work. Work that, unfortunately, because human civilizations told each other lies and wanted to take their neighbor's stuff, we still have to deal with today. It just takes one asshole to force everyone to commit espionage. Now, do I think that we can be outraged at their behavior and denounce on a personal level as human beings? Yes, absolutely. If you find something morally repugnant, especially if it hurts other people, you should call it out. And the amount of money we spend on espionage is unacceptably high. Especially because of things like social services not having the funding it needs, or things as basic as infrastructure having essentially zero assigned dollars. I mean, also the fact that they torture, maim, abuse, deceive, and kill people for an advantage is also horrific. So is the constant monitoring and tracking. So yes, overall it's an awful thing. Terrible industry, and one that is nowhere near as romantic, sexy, or honorable as we portray it in any way. We shouldn't have to do it, but it's the fact that it exists means that unfortunately we do. We just don't have to be happy about it. It's good to be back. Hopefully this is not the one that gets me blackbagged. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, why the CIA is justified putting things in people's butts, your opinions, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you like the topics just as much. Also remember to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at waytat_pods for more episode announcements and on occasion some other things. Also remember to watch Win Kashika on YouTube. Also remember to watch Win Kashika on Twitch, you filthy animal. Alright, have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, the FBI isn't watching you. Google is. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? I've been your host, William. Good night.